Now, here's what we're going to talk about in terms of scope. I have to admit that my propensity to overload my PowerPoints with too much stuff and then not be able to get through it is certainly still with me, but I decided I was going to do something about it this time by excising out of the scope of this particular presentation state law of Pennsylvania with regard to the particular diseases that we're going to talk about. And there's a reason for that, which I'll explain in a second. So we're just going to stick to the federal bovine disease control measures for 4 specific diseases: brucellosis, tuberculosis, foot and mouth disease, and BSE, or bovine spongiform encephalopathy, otherwise known as mad cow disease. I'll probably just say BSE most of the time here. So those are the 4 that we're going to talk about. And we're going to talk about the federal regulatory system that's there, or the federal animal disease control system that is there for those 4 diseases. This is kind of a good exercise in, back in February, we took the second part of our dairy legal webinar and talked about HPAI in dairy cattle, just that one disease and the regulatory measures thus far. And now we're going to talk about essentially the 4 big diseases, or 4 big diseases. There are a number of other bovine diseases that also sort of come on the radar, but these are sort of the big 4. We're going to talk about these separately. And it's another way of looking at the diversity of disease control measures and efforts that go on depending on the disease, and how the response from animal health authorities, it needs to be tailored to the actual disease, its conditions, what animals carry it, what animals can get it, how did they transmit it. All those things make for different sets of measures being taken specific to specific diseases and specific species of animals. So everything isn't the same in terms of what efforts you use to control a disease. And this is going to be a good example of looking through 4 different diseases and seeing what the efforts are. Yeah, and again, all of this talk comes from the fact that we're still in the midst of the high-path avian influenza outbreak that goes back to 2022 now, and has been with us ever since in various, shall we say, rates of frequency in various parts of the country. And that has been a very extreme response. The disease control measures that are being taken with regard to HPAI, particularly in poultry, as the first several years of this particular outbreak were sort of relegated to, let's say, or I shouldn't say poultry, all types of bird life, and some mammals. But the big issue obviously was the jump to dairy cattle, which then brought all its attention to the fact that HPAI can be carried by mammals. It actually has been ever since the beginning of this particular outbreak in 2022, because, for example, the first animals that actually were showing the disease that started all this in 2022 were seals off the coast of Canada, mammals. So, mammals have always been able to get it. In any event, we see a very big contrast in what was done with regard to avian species that were contracting it, particularly domestic avian species. And then when we had the crossover to cattle, and specifically dairy cattle, which we've covered, in an earlier session of this series, then we used a different set of measures. And there's not something inherently wrong or right about any one of them, because they all have to be tailored to the science of the particular disease that we're talking about. We will now go ahead and move into, and since we ended with mad cow, with foot and mouth disease, we will begin with foot and mouth disease. So this is very fortuitous, because right now, and literally like right now, in the last 5 to 6 days has been when this foot and mouth disease outbreak in Central Europe has essentially hit the news and, had been publicized all around the world. So the original detection was in Hungary. And this goes back to, I think the detection was not the beginning of last week, but I think it was technically the week before that. And I have a little map to show you in 1 second. So here's a couple of examples of the media coverage of this. These days, I try to stick to AP and Reuters at this point, just because there's so much sort of inflammatory things going on with regard to somehow that certain news sources are not trustworthy or what have you. So these are used to be considered as, middle of the road as you could possibly get. Perhaps not considered that way anymore. Don't know. Anyway, interesting that Prime Minister Orban from Hungary, where the first detection occurred, started floating these ideas about some sorts of biological attack. Now, pressed further, there has been absolutely no evidence that this foot and mouth disease outbreak was in any way, shape, or form an intentional act by, by a human. But things, who knows how, how it'll all shake out when it's said and done. I'll talk a little bit about foot and mouth disease more in a second, in terms of what the symptoms are and all that sort of stuff. But just in terms of the history of it, foot and mouth disease, this is the first case in the Central European sort of corridor, and it's most Hungary, Slovakia, Austria. That's the area. And then, of course, we see from what Chloe had told us about that, in fact, there is a detection in Germany also. These are the first cases in that region for 50 years. There are 11 infected sites confirmed across approximately 1,000 farms in the region that were tested so far. And border crossings are closing, and there's all sorts of import restrictions all over that region amongst all of those nations. And so, again, it started in Hungary, and then there were some other detections, and I'll show you a map in a second. At this point, the exact number of cows that have been culled, either because they're clearly showing illness or because they're trying to prevent the spread, is just being, we don't know the exact number. It's only being described in the media reports as thousands of cows having been culled in Hungary, but we don't really know the numbers. Okay, now here's the map. And this is here's a link to how you see the map up here in the upper left-hand corner. And by the way, the Hungary livestock census of December 2024 showed 861,000 head of cattle in the entire nation of Hungary. And that's about 1.2% of EU's total cattle stocks. And if you look at this little red circle where the 9 is, that is the border between Hungary and Slovakia, and that is where the majority of these positive detections have been on the Hungary side of that border. Up just a tad there, you see one that looks like it's kind of right on the an empty red circle there. That's a single case that's right on the border between Austria and Slovakia. And now the Czech Republic here does not have any cases, but up here right next to Berlin, you see the one German case that has now caused what Chloe told you about in terms of some of these import restrictions in Germany. So that's the layout of where the spread is now. Foot and mouth disease is not necessarily unknown or that rare in Central and Eastern Europe. That's one of the areas of the world that has had some frequency of cases. Now, by the way, this shows you something, and this is a pretty gruesome photograph, but this shows you, this was in the UK. They had a very nasty outbreak of foot and mouth disease in 2001. And, and this is the kind of thing that, we kind of have been exposed to frequently with regard to cattle disease outbreaks in the UK. And, you may be aware, maybe not, that, apart from this foot and mouth disease in 2001, this outbreak in the UK, where they, literally had more carcasses than they could possibly deal with, as this picture shows you, they also had the most recent significant mad cow disease cases, and we'll talk about that, and that goes all the way back to the sort of the 80s. So just to recap, this is material that I covered at the last session, but I just want to lay a little groundwork real quick so that we know what we're talking about again. The federal legal authority for animal disease efforts by USDA's APHIS is, again, it's here's the USDA org chart. APHIS is the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service right here, which is under the Undersecretary for Marketing and Regulatory Programs. And then if you look at the deputate, as they say, of that Undersecretary, here are all the programs that section of USDA is responsible for. This is the APHIS section. And then veterinary services right here is the actual organization that, of course, exercises all of these disease control measures under authority of what's called the Animal Health Protection Act. This was a statute that is very similar to Pennsylvania's domestic animal law, has all the authority that has authorized what's been done with HPAI, what's being done now with mad cow or with foot and mouth, and the things that I'm going to tell you about with with all of these other diseases. The Animal Health Protection Act is a 2002 drafting product, but it was taking many bits and pieces of many old laws and continuing to enact them over time. And then this most recent reenactment was 2002. It's not a giant law. It's not that long. Again, its purposes are to prevent and eliminate burdens on interstate commerce and foreign commerce by animal diseases, essentially. And it's concurrent with the state's intrastate authority. So these are, parallel government entities that work in the same space, state animal health control officials like our Bureau of Plant Industry at PDA and our state veterinary staff. And then there's USDA's APHIS staff, and, they're pretty much always working together in one fashion or another. The states depend highly on USDA's level of organization for a lot of their technical assistance and harder research things, some of the science behind some of the actions that are taken, as well as, of course, relying on the USDA for resources in a very big way. And we've talked about all that when we did the HPAI session. And again, probably the noteworthy thing about the Animal Health Protection Act is just how broad it really is, and the power that it gives to USDA-APHIS is quite expansive. It's power over import, export, and interstate movement, and then you can just sort of envision that the state authorities pick up, on the intrastate movement, so they all have to work together, and they all cover necessary sort of levels of the sandwich, shall we say. Again, what are they regulating? Pests and disease of livestock. Pests can be, microscopic organisms, et cetera, that, cause diseases. And also they could be other things. And here's the definition of what a pest is. It can be a plant and, or something else also, but you get the gist. And then how do they do that? They do that by orders and regulations. And orders are, such a big part of this. They are specific, orders that are either a general quarantine, which applies to a particular animal and its movement, or a particular disease and its movement, or there can be specific orders special orders of quarantine, which apply to specific real estate, specific locations, specific ag operations. That's sort of the terminology, a general quarantine order that applies in a broad way, or a special quarantine order that's all about the specifics at one particular farm, let's say. And of course, USDA likes to do everything by agreement. So while they have regs that say lots of things about entering orders, and that a lot of what they do is dependent upon essentially agreements that they enter into with the animal owner and the animal operations, management, to accomplish the objectives that need to be accomplished, and that they, you get more with attract more bees with honey than whatever other substance you want to put in. I forget what the actual old saying is, but in any event, cooperation with producers and animal owners always gets you further than, trying to order people around. And that's what USDA tries to adhere to as best as they're able to. Okay, so I'm gonna go through this quickly here so I have more time at the end. Of course, there's also seizure, quarantine, and disposal authority. And various legal standards that apply to the use of that. There's also extraordinary emergency authority, which we are into now with regard to HPAI. And that's when, the federal government can take actions to do things like, this is the term of art, preventative slaughter, meaning euthanizing animals that are in fact not ill yet or don't have a positive confirmation of a particular disease yet, but they are being euthanized for the purpose of preventing future spread. And of course, there's compensation available for the ordering of euthanization or depopulation, whatever terms you want to use. You don't get compensated, however, for animals that are already sick because they have no fair market value. You get compensated for animals and other products like eggs, perhaps, that you may have to, or milk, that you may have to destroy in order to prevent the disease. And there's two things. Indemnity is for the animals or eggs or milk, and compensation is for the manpower and the labor that a farmer has put into the efforts to try to clean, disinfect, compost carcasses, etc. All of that control of the disease that happens after the animal has been depopulated, and to clean the farm and get it ready to continue in business, and most importantly, not spread the disease to anyone else. Okay, so again, and then there's warrantless inspection authority, there's warrantless investigation powers, all things that we talked about at the last session. I just want to sort of review it with you again. And then, okay, the Animal Health Protection Act has sets of regulations. They're very short in many respects, and there are only regulations with regard to particular diseases for which there has been an occurrence sufficient for USDA to invest the time and effort into enacting regulations. And that's, a whole issue into itself, because you need the flexibility that quarantine orders give you. When you commit something hard and fast to a regulation, you're boxed in to some degree to a particular thing that you enacted. And a new disease or a new subtype of a disease or a new animal, is able to contract or transmit a particular disease that was not known before. All those things are, moving targets that, quarantine orders that can also be tailored to current happenings and be flexible in response to current happenings. Those are always going to work better than regs in a reg book that are committed to, etched in stone and box you in. So, the regs are not really what enforcing the Animal Health Protection Act is all about. Primarily, it's more about the quarantine orders and other things that go on. But in some cases, with certain diseases like tuberculosis, brucellosis, and foot and mouth disease, for example, they all do have some component of regulations that have been put on the books, but that's always supplemented with quarantine orders to adapt to particular circumstances. Now, the other document or the other thing in the arsenal that USDA-APHIS has at its disposal is what they call these foreign animal disease preparedness and response plans. And there's a little abbreviation, FAD, PrEP, FAD, PrEP. I don't know. In any event, they're just called the Red Books. And they are specific books that pertain to specific diseases. And they are basically the manual that says, this is what we're going to do in the event of an outbreak of this particular disease. We're going to use the authorities that we have in our regs and our statute, and we're going to have administrative procedures that we will that we have ironed out over the years, and we're going to put them in quarantine orders and disease control agreements that we sign with the property owners and the animal owners. And so the red books are kind of like the handbook for how USDA intends to conduct itself in the event of a future outbreak of the particular disease that the red book pertains to. Now, BSE doesn't have a red book, mad cow disease, because we've never had it, in a way there where that needed to be done. The risk and the potential occurrence rate here is so low in the U.S. that there's no red book for that. There is a red book for foot and mouth disease, however, and we're going to go take a look at that for a second. There is not one for tuberculosis or brucellosis. Here's a general red book, which is all about sort of, this is how APHIS will handle itself in any disease format. That's what this document is here. And then these are the red books that exist right now with regard to, you could sort of call them the familiar and potentially recurring diseases that they essentially want to get this all down on paper ahead of time. And, there is, of course, the high path avian influenza red book, which we talked about when I did this back in February, I guess it was. And then here's the foot and mouth red book. I'll show you that in a second. There's a classical swine fever red book, and there's a Newcastle disease red book. That is it. So, again, none of the other diseases that we're here to talk about today have their own red books. So it's going to be the law, the regs, such as they are, and quarantine orders will be the tools used. Now, here's the foot and mouth disease red book. So we're going to go back down. Remember, we told you that Hungary had the outbreak, and it's literally going on as we speak. Foot and mouth disease, let's talk about it. I'll try to go through each one of these diseases, tell you what the disease essentially is, and then what the measures are that are available to be employed, and are what USDA-APHIS, excuse me for a second, intends to employ. So hang on a second. Believe it or not, I just spilled some water on my keyboard, but it seems to be working okay. I think we will see. Oh, wait a minute. Sorry, give me 1 second. Let's see. I want to just find out where I am because my screen has now changed. And look. Yeah, there we go. There we go. Okay. Okay, sorry about that. Never did that before. Okay, so the foot and mouth red book was last updated in 2020. So this would be the thing that would kick in should this, the disease that is now, at least one confirmed case in Germany and, and cases in Hungary. And I think that one that's on the border is technically in Austria, I believe. Now, foot and mouth disease, highly contagious. These are excerpts directly out of the red book here. Highly contagious viral disease that may affect cloven-hooved animals, so cattle, swine, sheep, goats, and many wild animals also too, bison, etc. Particularly bison. That's one of the ones that and elk and deer. It's characterized by a fever, vesicular, blister-like lesions. I think I said that right. And then turning into ulcers on the surface of the mouth, tongue, nostrils, etc. So various sort of mucous membranes and other places, muzzle, feet, teeth. Okay. Does not typically kill adult livestock if they get it, but it has a detrimental effect on productivity for milk productivity, as well as the usability of the meat. That is a definite way that it gets transferred. So that is a way that once you have contracted the disease, that animal's out of the the meat system. But it has a very high mortality rate in younger animals. animals. It's not considered a public health risk to humans. It is one of the most contagious diseases of livestock and a high priority concern in USDA-APHIS's eyes. The United States has been foot and mouth free since 1929. Canada has been foot and mouth free since 1952, and Mexico has been foot and mouth free since 1954. However, foot and mouth disease essentially is found in essentially 2/3 of the world's countries. So it is a little bit everywhere. In terms of the U.S. Livestock, there's the susceptible animals, according to, APHIS in 2017 data, is essentially 93 million cattle, 72 million swine, and 8 million sheep and goats. Now, here's a link to the USDA's homepage. And, you guys probably know my PowerPoints are always full of links, so get yourself the PowerPoint. Again, there was this giant outbreak of foot and mouth disease in the UK back in 2001. That was the one that the photograph was from, and the estimate of damage was $12 to $18 billion in economic impact from that particular foot and mouth disease in cattle. Infections in humans are rare. There have been essentially approximately 40 cases diagnosed in humans since 1921. So those are the kind of numbers that mean, it's a very minimal risk. I forget if this is the one that calls it a negligible risk, but in any event, mortality in the animals is significant and can approach 100%. That's of the young animals. Remember the little note we had on one of the earlier slides. Mortality is typically low in adult animals, 1 to 2%, but higher in very young animals can even approach 100%. Indemnity and compensation work very similar to the HPAI system. You're paid for the animals that are ordered to be depopulated. You're not paid for animals that are already contracted the disease and have tested positive. There is the possibility of an emergency developed vaccination. However, a previously developed vaccination is not really going to be helpful, because you got to have the vaccine with regard to this disease has to match the disease. So you're going to end up having you're going to have to develop it on an emergency basis after the strain of the disease is known. And that's what that second to last bullet point's all about. Now, in the poultry world, they've taken the stamp out approach, which is this idea of essentially taking the most aggressive tactic to stamp this disease out as soon as it's found, in whatever the flock is that it's found in, with HPAI, the idea was stamp it out as quickly and as aggressively and as thoroughly as you possibly can by depopulating every possible method of transmission, i.e. every possible other avian, domestic bird that you have in your possession, so to speak, on that same site. Now, that is not the approach that is taken with foot and mouth disease. One reason being that the mortality rate, particularly for adults, isn't quite or isn't anything like the mortality rate for for birds and other types of avian species. Foot and mouth has been historically controlled by depopulation, but at this point in the United States, complete stamping out of anything beyond a simple focal foot and mouth outbreak may not be a viable or sustainable response strategy. So this is getting to the point of, there's variability in these disease responses, and it doesn't mean that the approach may be less aggressive is somehow wrong. It's that, each case or each disease and each outbreak has to be assessed as to what is going to be the tolerable and effective means of controlling the disease. The cost of implementing a total stamping out strategy for foot and mouth would be inordinately high. All right, so more justifications in here for why the stamp out approach does not work with foot and mouth disease. The depopulation and disposal of large numbers of animals may not be publicly acceptable. I mean, you can just imagine if we had scenes like what we saw in that photograph with the cow carcasses in England during the 2001 foot and mouth disease. Sometimes there's what's the word for it? The social license of, how tolerable is it to be depopulating these quantities of animals, even if there was federal money available to do it that widespread. There's not sufficient capacity to rapidly depopulate and appropriately dispose of these, large numbers of large animals. There's going to be the economic losses are just going to be huge. And so this is a nice example of sort of USDA-APHIS explaining why the stamp out approach of just let's depopulate, every cow in the herd if we got one case of mad cow disease of foot and mouth disease does not fit. That solution doesn't fit this particular outbreak. All right, next slide. See if there we go. Okay, so now let's move on to brucellosis. Brucellosis is different entirely. At the top of the slide, you have all the resources that you can look at, including there is a brucellosis and tuberculosis map that sort of maps all the outbreaks, going back years and years and years. That's the last link in this little string up at the top here. Okay, it's a bacterial infection that spreads from animal to animal via bodily fluids or tissues or milk. It causes, very significant consequences in the sense that it essentially causes brucellosis can cause spontaneous abortions and the loss of, pregnancies in cattle and complications with retained afterbirth. So lots of, reproductive problems that this disease causes. Also, fertility decreases pretty significantly. And then you get weak, unhealthy calves, you get decreased milk production, you get, sort of unexplainable weight loss. And so you get all kinds of different symptoms here in brucellosis. It occurs mainly in cattle, bison, and swine, but it also can affect other animals. And it's been present in the United States since about 1930s. Brucellosis, the U.S. is brucellosis free. Except for, this is kind of an interesting, little tidbit. There is a pocket of brucellosis in wild bison and elk around Yellowstone Park. And that is what they call the last remaining reservoir of the disease in the United States that has not been eradicated by all the efforts that have gone on for a number of decades. Human risk is very low, but it does exist. And it's usually by drinking unpasteurized milk is how brucellosis can be transmitted to a human, and or if there's some sort of contact with, it says birthing tissues. Again, these are quotes right out of, uh-oh, now I'm having some more problems with my screen. Okay, so far so good. Now, the brucellosis testing, people may be very aware, is part of the PMO because of its ability to be transmitted through milk. Vaccinations, yes, there is a very common vaccination for brucellosis. Otherwise, there is no other treatment for it. So this is one where there is a vaccination. Foot and mouth disease we're gonna have to have the outbreak first before a vaccine gets developed. Okay, next slide. Oh, okay, this is a slide on tuberculosis. Now, right now, up in the upper right-hand corner, you see there's a little dot on the map where Michigan is. That is, in fact, we actually have one case of bovine tuberculosis right now that is being tracked, and it's in Michigan. That's what that little dot is. Now, tuberculosis, obviously, is something that is sort of familiar to, us, from its history in the 20th century, as a human disease. But it is an infectious disease that is caused by a bacteria, and it can it can sort of be a chronic debilitating disease, but occasionally it will go into an acute stage and have a rapidly progressive course that brings, about the demise essentially of the animal. But it is not always a death sentence, so to speak. It's not always fatal. It is one of the most common zoonotic diseases that can go back and forth, or can be contracted by humans. And essentially, the tuberculosis that we get is the same one that goes around and around. Somebody has a question here about, if you vaccinate for brucellosis, well, I heard be certified, so I don't have to test every 3 years. I don't know the answer to that specifically. Hang on, let me keep going through. Okay, tuberculosis is spread by direct contact between animals, inhalation of droplets expelled from the infected lungs of another animal, and that's how we can get it too, or ingestion of contaminated feed or milk. And it's one of these federally reportable diseases that, as soon as there's a case of bovine tuberculosis, it needs to be reported to federal and state authorities. The National Tuberculosis Eradication Program started in 1917, and by all accounts has been extremely successful. Here's the bovine infection rate on the bottom of the screen here is approximately 7 cows per million. So it's not the kind of disease that has the type of incident rate that would dictate a much stronger response. So next slide, please. Oh, okay. Let me go. You know what? Can you go back for a second, Audrey, real quick? So the essentially the measure that's being pursued right now is simply a national surveillance program, and it's a surveillance program of slaughtered animals. So that's what we're looking at now to keep our eyes on this disease, and that's what USDA-APHIS does. Is essentially just doing a surveillance program. We've been in the clear for a while from tuberculosis, in any serious way. Let's put it that way. At least in bovines. Okay, let's go ahead. Next one. Next slide. Sorry. And now we get to mad cow disease. Obviously, this is the major event in animal disease in the last several decades. If you don't know much about mad cow disease, it is not a bacterial infection. It's not a virus. It's one of these oddball protein cells called a prion that infects the brain of the animal, progressively deteriorating their entire nervous system until they die. And so it is a death sentence. It is a 100% fatal disease. Now the interesting part is that it takes so long, 3 to 6 years after the initial infection, for any signs to show up, and then a death within anywhere from 2 weeks to 6 months after those signs show up. So a cow can be carrying this thing around in their spinal column, in their brain, for years before there's anything that's objectively detected. Here's a couple of links to some of the main BSE documents that are maintained by USDA-APHIS. The big outbreak, of course, started in 1985 in the UK, now we have a rate in the US of about 1 case per 1 million cows. The World Health Organization classifies the U.S. as in a negligible risk, or being a negligible risk, which is the high, or the safest you can be. That's the highest you can sort of score on things. In U.S. history for mad cow, we have had 7 cases. The first was in 2003, and that was caused by a cow that was imported from Canada with the disease. The other 6 cases that the U.S. has had were, in fact, simply what's called the atypical BSE, which is a naturally occurring brain disease that does not have anything consuming the prions from a prior source. And so those are kind of discounted in the risk. So if you really wanted to look at it from a disease or an animal to animal type of contraction of mad cow disease, U.S. has really only ever had one, because the other have been naturally occurring, medical conditions that were not contracted from an outside source. Okay, next slide. And then here are all the supply chain problems that have been caused by the detection of mad cow disease in the UK, and then the need to put measures in place in the US so that we never experience what they experienced. Prohibiting mammalian meat and bone meal from being included in animal feed. That's since 1997, and that is in fact, specifically because of the potential to be passing those mad cow disease prions through bone meal, or meat and bone meal, as it's described here, in various types and other feed material that has, animal-derived sources. Banning specific risk materials like brain and spinal column from animals that are at least 30 months or older, because that's when it has the time to actually develop the prions, and it's grown to its sort of full flower, and it's then able to transmit to other animals by coming in contact with or eating that brain or spinal cord material. So that's why since 2009, rendering plants, for example, do no longer take the brains or spinal columns of cows, but also other animals, could also carry it too. So that's why we had so much, problems in the rendering world, because no one's taking brains or spinal cords, and nobody's going to pay to extract those things from a cow carcass. So, that's why the sort of rendering, industry has dried up and blown away. And that's why landfills also don't want to take animal carcasses any longer. I'll just tell you this. There is a whole litany here of supply chain changes that were made in order to, or as they were made as control measures for mad cow disease. And of course, prions, the way in which mad cow disease is transmitted, are not extinguished or terminated by incineration. So, the recommended method to kill, or to stop the continued risk of mad cow from one contracted animal, is to essentially have the animal digested in a alkaline digester, as opposed to standard other efforts like composting or incineration or what have you. Now, all right, next slide.
So thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. And the next quarterly dairy legal webinar will be in July 15th. It's going to be 2025 federal milk marketing order reforms. And then next Friday, we've got the Understanding Ag Law with PA Ag exemptions for inheritance tax and real estate transfers. So thanks so much, and hopefully we'll see you next week or next month.